It took just 9 minutes, one sealed transcript, and a single woman standing alone in court before a Supreme Court justice began to question her own judgment. But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It came after years of silence, of warnings ignored, of backroom decisions never meant to see daylight. What happened inside that federal courtroom didn't look like a revolution. No raised voices, no chaos, just one congresswoman, no legal team, holding a plain folder, and the weight of everything the system had tried to bury. She wasn't there to win. She was there to speak. And what she revealed didn't just shake the courtroom. It cracked something deeper. Because if the truth, spoken calmly, without rage, without protection, can make the highest bench in America go still, then maybe the question isn't what happened in that courtroom. Maybe the question is, what else have we been told to stay silent about? And to understand how we got to that moment, we need to go back to where it all began. Not in Washington, not in court, but in a small, overheated gymnasium in Toledo, Ohio, where one tired woman stood up and asked a question that turned the room to stone. The gymnasium smelled faintly of floor polish and old banners. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly with every power surge from the overworked AC unit that had clearly given up the fight. Foldable metal chairs lined the room in tight rows, half of them already occupied by residents of Toledo's East Side, most over 50, some in veterans' hats, others in work boots, eyes tired but focused. The ones who showed up to town halls like this didn't come for spectacle. They came because they'd been let down too many times to stay home again. Jasmine Crockett stood at the front, microphone in one hand, her other resting lightly on a table stacked with policy briefs. Her navy blue blouse clung to her back. She hadn't had time to change since landing. Red-eye flights were never forgiving, and neither were constituents who'd lost faith in promises. But she was here, not because it was convenient, but because she knew what it meant when people stopped showing up for each other. She had just wrapped up her 17th question, something about infrastructure permits and rail zoning, when the hand went up. It was from the back. A woman, maybe in her mid-50s, salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, stood slowly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. Why do judges keep making decisions that hurt us, even when we vote for change? The room went completely still. No one whispered. No one shifted in their seat. Even the aide holding Jasmine's water bottle froze mid-step. The question had no preamble, no anger, just a clean, sharp truth that everyone in the room had felt, but never dared to say out loud in front of a microphone. Jasmine didn't blink. Her instinct told her she could sidestep it, throw in a line about judicial independence or pending legislation. But something deeper held her still. Maybe it was the woman's tone. Maybe it was the silence that followed. Or maybe it was that Jasmine had asked herself that same question more times than she could count, when she saw innocent people sentenced without evidence, or watched cases disappear when a wealthy last name was involved. So she didn't deflect. She took one small step forward. Because too many judges, she said evenly, don't fear the people anymore. A murmur moved like static across the floor. Some of them, she continued, think they're untouchable. And some of them are. That's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. A man in the second row shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the exit coughed. Jasmine could feel the energy in the room change, and still she didn't stop. She spoke about lifetime appointments, about judges who campaign behind closed doors, who hold stocks in companies they later rule in favor of, about a woman in Indiana whose eviction case was dismissed while the judge vacationed with her landlord's attorney. She didn't mention names. She didn't need to. The facts were enough to make the room feel colder, even as the AC wheezed and failed. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. She didn't dramatize, but it hit like a quiet storm, controlled, intentional, and impossible to ignore. And then something happened. Someone in the audience lifted a phone. Then another. They weren't live streaming. Not yet. Just recording, quietly, just in case. Because even they could feel it. This wasn't just another town hall. This was a moment, a tear in the polite fabric of public discourse, the kind of moment that gets clipped, captioned, taken out of context, and passed around the country before anyone can explain what really happened. Jasmine wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to be honest. But honesty in America had a cost. And Jasmine Crockett was about to pay it. It started with a single clip, just 38 seconds long, grainy, handheld, with shaky audio and bad fluorescent lighting. Jasmine Crockett, standing alone at a folding table in a gymnasium, telling the truth. No theatrics, no prepared soundbite. Just her voice, steady and surgical. Too many judges don't fear the people anymore. Some of them are untouchable. By hour 2, it had been posted to 3 different community Facebook groups. By hour 4, it hit Twitter. By hour 6, a major left-leaning page reposted it with the caption, "Finally, someone in Congress says what we've all been thinking." But by hour 8, it had crossed the aisle. And that's when the explosion began. Hour 9, Fox Nation, Newsmax, The Daily Signal. The framing wasn't subtle. Radical Democrat launches verbal assault on America's judges. Edited versions spliced her voice with courtroom gavel slams, blurred courtroom faces, and out-of-context headlines. Her tone had been measured. Their tone was fire. Commentators with perfect hair and clipped anger called her dangerous, disrespectful, a threat to judicial integrity. One even suggested, without irony, that she be formally censured or removed from Congress altogether. Another asked whether she was trying to start a riot. By hour 11, Jasmine's office inbox was filling faster than her staff could sort it. Subject lines screamed in all caps, "Shame on you! Judicial hatred is terrorism. You should be disbarred." By hour 12, her personal cell rang. Unknown number, then another, and another. Voicemail after voicemail. Some anonymous, some bold, all venomous. "You're gonna regret that little speech, Missy. You want to talk about fear? We'll show you fear. Better watch your back, bitch." Her staff tried to pull her from the news feed, but Jasmine wouldn't look away. Not because she didn't feel the fear. She did. It coiled in her stomach like a loaded spring. But she had to understand how fast the truth could be distorted, how quickly a measured statement could be weaponized against her, twisted into a caricature of lawlessness. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spoken about judges who were immune to consequence. Now the system was rushing to make her an example. There was a certain poetry to it. Bloody, bitter poetry. Her comms director begged her to release a clarification. "Just a few words," she urged, "to soften the tone, to cool things down." Jasmine said no. She stood by the window of her D.C. office that night, the Capitol dome glowing in the distance, and whispered to herself, "If I walk it back now, I'm not just erasing my words, I'm erasing every person they were meant to protect." But even then, she didn't realize how far the backlash would go. The next morning, House leadership called a closed-door meeting. Whispers of "conduct unbecoming" were already circulating. Someone had filed a formal complaint to the House Ethics Committee. She wasn't told who. She didn't need to be. She could see the playbook unfolding in real time. Outside reporters were already circling. The clip had crossed 10 million views. Gag the Truth was trending. Conservative blogs had started digging. Old footage, old votes. Even her father's military record was being posted, dissected, picked apart. She wasn't surprised, just angry, not for herself, but for what it meant, for how easily the system turned against someone when they stopped playing nice. Jasmine Crockett hadn't screamed. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't thrown a chair. But in America, sometimes the most dangerous thing a black woman can do is speak calmly, with facts about power. She released the full clip online. No edits, no spin, just the whole truth, unfiltered. Then an hour later, she released another post, a thread, documenting every example she had mentioned, every ruling, every code violation, every instance of misconduct that had gone unpunished. She didn't caption it with outrage, just one line. "If truth feels like an attack, maybe it's time to ask why." It came without ceremony, just a flat, unmarked envelope slid across her chief of staff's desk at 7:42 a.m. No seal, no courier signature, no official watermark, just thick ivory paper folded precisely, with the kind of bureaucratic chill that didn't need bold lettering to feel dangerous. Jasmine Crockett wasn't in the room when it arrived. She was down the hall in a committee prep session, flipping through housing policy amendments and sipping her second coffee of the day. She didn't see the pale look on her assistant's face, the sudden hush that fell over the outer office, or the way her scheduler whispered, "This can't be right." The letter was addressed directly to her. No title. No Congresswoman Crockett. Just her name, Jasmine Yvette Crockett. It was signed by the United States Judicial Oversight Commission, the body most Americans didn't know existed, the body that rarely, almost never, contacted elected officials directly. Inside, no list of allegations, no cited statute, no formal charge. Just a date, a room number, a location, Thomas F. Eagleton Federal Courthouse, St. Louis. Hearing Room 3, B. Presiding Authority, Justice Elena Kagan. There was no explanation, just a phrase printed in bold type near the bottom, appearance required in consideration of statements concerning judicial integrity. Her legal team went silent when they read it. One finally spoke. "This isn't protocol. Supreme Court justices don't conduct oversight hearings. That's not their role." Another added, "And even if they did, why her? Why Kagan?" There were no answers, only the undeniable weight of what this letter meant. It wasn't an inquiry, it wasn't a warning, it was a chess move, played with deliberate ambiguity, a signal cloaked as formality. Jasmine was not being charged, not yet, but she was being summoned, not by a committee, not by a court clerk, but by one of the most powerful judicial figures in the country. The message was clear. You rattled the wrong cage. Now walk into it. By noon, calls were coming in from party leadership, whispers behind closed doors, some urging caution, some urging silence. "Play this smart," one warned. "This isn't the hill to die on." Another offered a back-channel compromise, a private statement, a moderated clarification, a polite walkback of her remarks. Jasmine listened. She nodded. She thanked them for their concern. Then she did what she always did when the system turned vague and quiet. She prepared for war, no lawyer, no spin team, no entourage. That night she booked a one-way flight to St. Louis. She packed a black suit, flat shoes, and one briefcase. Inside it, copies of judicial ethics codes, printed rulings, annotated transcripts, 3 sealed manila folders, and a single quote scribbled on a yellow post-it, stuck to the top sheet like a talisman. "Speak even when your voice shakes." The day before the hearing, she checked into a modest hotel off Lindell Boulevard. No press knew she was there. No staff followed. The rain that tapped against her window wasn't a storm. It was a warning. In the room's dim yellow light, she highlighted case after case, recited constitutional passages under her breath, and circled names in red ink. She wasn't preparing a defense. She was preparing a reckoning. Because this wasn't just a summons. It was a trap dressed in decorum. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't walking into it, afraid. She was walking in ready. The courthouse loomed like a fortress, tall, gray, and impenetrable. Sharp winds sliced through the streets of downtown St. Louis, scattering loose papers and bending the umbrellas of the reporters who weren't allowed inside. The main entrance of the Thomas F. Eagleton Federal Courthouse was flanked by 2 lines of protesters. One side held cardboard signs reading, "Truth is not contempt," and "No gag on Crockett." The other side shouted slogans Jasmine had heard too many times before, phrases about order, decorum, and respect for robes that too often shielded misconduct. Jasmine stepped out of the black SUV without a word. No security detail, no staffers flanking her, just her and a worn leather case clutched in her right hand. She paused for half a second at the bottom of the stone steps, just long enough to hear someone yell, "Coward," from the opposing crowd, and someone else yell back, "She's the only one telling the truth." She didn't flinch. She climbed the stairs with the same resolve she'd had walking into courtrooms as a public defender, back when her heels were scuffed and her clients couldn't afford bail. But this wasn't that kind of courtroom. This one was silent. Inside, the usual buzz of federal hearings was gone. No clicking of press cameras. No microphones clipped to lapels. Cell phones had been confiscated at the security checkpoint. Metal detectors scanned every pen. The air carried the heavy weight of solemnity, manufactured and carefully maintained. The gallery was already packed. Former judges, congressional aides, law students. Two state representatives from Indiana sat in the second row, whispering tightly behind a legal pad. Every eye tracked Jasmine as she entered. No one smiled. No one nodded. It wasn't hostility. It was something worse. Calculated neutrality. At exactly 9 a.m., the back doors opened. Justice Elena Kagan stepped in, her black robe flowing behind her like a curtain being pulled across a stage. She didn't stop to acknowledge the gallery. She didn't glance at the press table, because there wasn't one. Her eyes went straight to the woman already seated at the defendant's table, who wasn't a defendant at all, not formally. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't a standard proceeding. Kagan looked tired, not physically, but in the way that came from carrying the weight of too many closed-door decisions and compromises swallowed for the sake of judicial preservation. Her eyes were sharp but cautious. Her gait was even but heavy. As she took her seat, the clerk stood. "This special hearing is now in session," he said, "in the matter of Representative Jasmine Crockett and statements made regarding judicial integrity." Jasmine didn't move. Her hands were folded neatly on the table. No notes in front of her, just the briefcase on the floor at her feet. Justice Kagan adjusted her robe, cleared her throat, and spoke. "Representative Crockett," she began, her voice steady but clipped, "you stand before this court not on criminal grounds, but on concern for conduct unbecoming of a sitting member of Congress. Statements which, in the court's view, may have incited a breach of public trust and called into question the legitimacy of the judiciary without due cause." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. No one coughed. No one whispered. The silence was surgical. "This proceeding," Kagan continued, "is not criminal. However, contempt, especially indirect, can erode institutions we all rely on. You have been given the opportunity to respond freely." That last word hung in the air like a challenge. Jasmine rose slowly, not in defiance, in precision. Her voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, and deliberate. "I won't insult your intelligence, Justice Kagan," she said, "by pretending I didn't know my words would land hard. I chose them carefully, and I stand by them." The room didn't breathe. "I'm not here to cause chaos. I'm here to name it." Justice Kagan leaned slightly forward, the worn wood of the bench beneath her hands, her fingers folded with surgical precision. Her eyes didn't move from Jasmine. "You've made serious claims today about this court," she said, voice even, almost too even. "And yet you sit here without legal counsel. Why?" The question wasn't procedural, it was rhetorical, a warning dressed as curiosity. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't even shift her weight. Instead, she took one slow breath, then answered. "I don't need a lawyer to tell the truth," she said. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was steady, clean, like steel pulled from a sheath. The words echoed, not loudly but fully. They landed not with volume, but with weight. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen stopped scribbling. A man in the back row let out a breath too loud, then immediately stiffened. Even Kagan's jaw twitched, barely. Truth, not evidence, not motion. Truth. The word wasn't supposed to matter in a room like this. But Jasmine had made it the centerpiece. "I need this room to hear what no one else will say," she added, "not because I want to break things, but because things are already broken." A ripple moved through the audience. Not noise, not murmurs, but a shift in posture, like everyone had just realized the floor wasn't as stable as it looked. Justice Kagan kept her expression controlled, but a subtle tightness formed near the corners of her eyes. "Truth without discipline," she replied, "is chaos. The judiciary does not answer to outrage or popularity. It answers to law." Jasmine didn't argue. She stepped away from the table, walking slowly to the center of the room. The silence around her felt taut, like stretched wire. She stopped and faced the bench. "That's part of the problem," she said. "You see people like me, black, direct, unflinching, and assume emotion. You assume recklessness. But I spent 3 nights cross-referencing judicial behavior reports. I memorized the 2009 Hartley-Verdow case, where a judge accepted gifts from a private defense firm and never saw the inside of a courtroom discipline hearing. She paused, let it breathe. You think I'm being reckless? I'm being methodical. That line didn't just land, it struck, like a slow blade through armor. Justice Kagan's gaze flicked downward, only briefly. Her hands adjusted the gavel, but she didn't lift it. I know what contempt is, Jasmine continued, her voice lower now, more dangerous in its control. Contempt isn't naming a problem. It's pretending it doesn't exist. That pulled something out of the gallery, a sharp exhale, a hand moving quickly across a notepad. Kagan shifted again, not out of discomfort, but because the room had changed. It was no longer about courtroom protocol. It was about legitimacy. And Jasmine wasn't on trial anymore. The institution was. Representative Crockett, Kagan said finally, this court recognizes your preparation. But the issue at hand is not whether misconduct exists. It is whether your comments, broadcast nationally, have deliberately undermined faith in the courts. Then came the dagger. What if someone had acted violently, citing your words? Jasmine didn't flinch. Then maybe you should ask, she said quietly, why our court system is so fragile that one woman's voice could shake it. Silence. Heavy, layered, blistering. And then she added, maybe the problem isn't what I said. Maybe the problem is how long people like me have been silent. The gavel hadn't moved, but everyone in that courtroom knew. The standoff had just begun. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace. She simply bent down, unclasped the worn leather briefcase at her feet, and pulled out a stack of documents, bound tightly with a red rubber band. The entire courtroom followed the movement. Small, deliberate, final. I'm not here to perform, she said, calmly peeling the band away and laying the stack flat on the table. I'm here to submit the record. Her fingers were steady as she separated the pages, each marked, annotated, color-coded. The first was a ruling from 2016, U.S. versus Menard, in which a federal judge dismissed critical surveillance evidence due to a procedural error. That same judge was later photographed attending a fundraiser hosted by the defendant's legal team. Next came an ethics complaint from 2019, buried deep in administrative records, against a magistrate who had ruled on 37 cases involving a corporate donor to his family foundation. Jasmine placed a photocopy of the donation report beside it, like a puzzle piece snapping into place. These are not accusations, she said, turning to face the bench, and this isn't a vendetta. She tapped her finger twice on the stack. This is a record. A low rustle passed through the gallery, not the sound of skepticism, something quieter, more dangerous. Realization. Justice. Kagan's gaze dropped to the top sheet. The courtroom's tension began to shift. It was no longer weighted toward the bench. It was pooling at the center of the room, where Jasmine stood, and where every page she presented began to feel like a mirror. These rulings were never reversed, Jasmine continued. These judges were never investigated. These complaints? Never answered. And yet you're sitting here questioning my conduct. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They had the rhythm of cross-examination and the pressure of truth stripped bare. She held up a ruling from the Southern District of Texas. This judge dismissed a class action lawsuit involving a pharmaceutical company, then joined their advisory board 6 months later. The official response? No evidence of bias, no follow-up, no public memo. Case closed. She moved to another. In this one, Judge Avery Neal signed off on the destruction of internal police body cam footage, then wrote an op-ed praising law enforcement transparency the same month. No reprimand, no ethical review, just a promotion to appellate court. Justice Kagan sat still, but her fingers were no longer steepled. They were flat on the bench now, tense, unmoving. Jasmine placed a final sheet atop the others. The gallery had stopped shifting. No one wrote, no one coughed. The silence was now reverent and terrified. You asked why I didn't bring a lawyer, she said softly, but no lawyer could have delivered this without having it dismissed as grandstanding. No team could have stood here without you saying this was political. So I came alone, with paper, with timestamps, with names. Then she looked directly at the bench. You say I've undermined public trust, but these documents, these rulings, these absences of consequence, they are what cracked that trust open. All I did was say it out loud. The red folder now lay open, the pages fanned out like evidence at a crime scene. But this wasn't one crime. It was a system, and Jasmine Crockett had just drawn the chalk outline. Jasmine didn't pause to let the weight of her last words settle. She reached into the side pocket of her briefcase and pulled out a second folder, this one thinner, but wrapped in a translucent sleeve, as if what was inside needed protection from even the air. This, she said, her tone still even but sharper now, was never meant to be seen outside internal review. She held it up with both hands, no flourish, just precision, and handed it to the bailiff. He took it with visible hesitation, as though he already knew it carried something heavier than ink. He stepped forward and placed it on the bench in front of Justice Kagan, who hadn't moved in minutes. The following is a verified letter from a former administrative coordinator inside the Office of Judicial Integrity, Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the thick air. Dated just 6 months ago. Justice Kagan's eyes scanned the header. The seal was faint but real. Her jaw tightened slightly. Jasmine continued, her cadence unshaken. In this letter, the whistleblower describes a series of delays, intentional ones, ordered internally to postpone misconduct investigations until certain judges reached retirement age. She stepped toward the center of the room again. No podium, no protection, just her and a truth too long buried. The justification, she said, to protect the integrity of their legacy. Their legacy, Justice Kagan. Not the law, not the victims, not the people who walked into their courtrooms thinking justice meant something. No, legacy. A hush fell over the gallery, not because they were shocked, but because they weren't. And that realization, how unsurprised they were, made the silence heavier. Jasmine locked eyes with Kagan. That phrase appears 4 times in the letter. Once in direct reference to a judge accused of suppressing civil rights evidence in a wrongful conviction case. A man who sentenced 2 black teens to 20 years on tampered audio, then had his file sealed just 2 months before retirement. Kagan didn't speak, but her fingers had curled slightly inward, gripping the edge of the bench. Jasmine nodded toward the letter still unopened. You'll find case IDs, internal routing memos, timestamps, and even an email chain where a senior ethics officer says, and I quote, "Let this ride. We don't stain robes when they're about to be hung up." The quote hit the room like a depth charge. Someone near the back gasped quietly. A woman in the front row pressed her fingers against her lips. A law student scribbled furiously, though his hand was trembling. Jasmine didn't let the moment slip away. This isn't rumor. It's not partisan. It's not performative. It's a paper trail, and it leads somewhere none of us want to admit exists. A place where power protects itself, even when it knows it's guilty. Still, Kagan remained silent, but the shift in her posture was unmistakable. Her body leaned slightly forward, not in aggression, but in attention. The way someone leans forward when they realize they've been given something they can't ignore. Jasmine returned to the table, picked up another page and added, "There's more. Judges who attended private dinners with litigants, others who invested in companies while presiding over their merger hearings. Each time, dismissed. Each time, sealed. And every time, the excuse is the same: insufficient evidence or no compelling interest for the public." She paused, not because she needed to, but because she wanted the room to feel the suffocation of that phrase, no compelling interest. She looked back up. "What is the public's interest?" she asked, voice quiet now. "If not to know when its justice is being sold?" No one had an answer. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the walls were folding inward around the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. Kagan looked down at the letter again, her brow creased, her hand unmoving on the cover sheet. Jasmine's voice dropped to a near whisper, razor sharp and unflinching. "You summoned me here to explain myself, But maybe the real question is, how many others should have been summoned long before me? For a moment, Jasmine just stood there, still, quiet. The gallery held its breath as she reached back into her briefcase, slower this time, as if what she was about to reveal carried more than just words. It carried weight that could shift walls. What she pulled out wasn't bulky, it wasn't flashy, just a single manila envelope. But the way she held it, with both hands, steady and reverent, signaled something different, something final. This, she said, turning toward the bench, is a transcript from a sealed arbitration hearing dated February 12th, 2020. She took 2 steps forward, not grandstanding, just deliberate. In it, a federal judge, still active, was recorded coaching a private legal team on how to phrase their settlement offer so it would appear neutral in open court. That was the moment. The air shifted. The gallery didn't gasp. It froze. The kind of freeze that happens when people realize they're witnessing something that can't be undone. Jasmine continued, calm as glass. The same judge later ruled in favor of that team. The transcript was sealed 2 days after a journalist requested access, retroactively and without procedural justification. She handed the envelope to the clerk, who blinked twice before accepting it, as if unsure whether his fingers should even touch it. He walked it to the bench and placed it in front of Justice Kagan, with the hesitation of someone setting down a live wire. Kagan stared at it. She didn't reach for it right away. "How did you obtain this?" she asked, her voice suddenly brittle. "I won't disclose the source," Jasmine answered, "but I can confirm it was never legally classified. The seal was applied only after media inquiries began. I had it vetted by 2 constitutional attorneys, both former judicial clerks, and a court reporter who was later fired without explanation." Kagan's eyes finally dropped to the envelope. Her fingers brushed the edge of the flap, but didn't open it yet. Something in her jaw clenched. The robe on her shoulders suddenly looked heavier. Jasmine stepped back, letting the weight of the moment fall where it needed to. "If you want to discipline me for speaking up," she said, her voice now threaded with steel, "say it clearly. But don't pretend this is about decorum. This is about a silence that got too comfortable, and now it's been broken." Justice Kagan opened the envelope. She read the first page. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She read the second page. And that's when it happened. Her right hand, still holding the page, trembled, just enough for the courtroom to notice, just enough to confirm what no one wanted to say aloud. This wasn't politics anymore. This was proof. She closed the file slowly, deliberately, as if containing something dangerous. Then she looked up, eyes darker, more distant, no longer in control of the moment. "This court will recess," she said, her voice thinner now. 15 minutes. She didn't wait for the clerk. She stood and walked off the bench without another word. The bailiff called the recess, but no one moved. For a long beat, the courtroom just sat there. No whispers, no rustling, no movement. Just the slow, collective exhale of a room that had been holding its breath for too long. Something had changed, and everyone knew it. The door clicked shut behind her like the closing of a vault. Justice Elena Kagan stood still in the middle of her temporary chambers, flanked by heavy bookshelves and tall windows, curtained against the gray morning outside. The walls here were supposed to offer distance, neutrality, but today they closed in around her like concrete. She looked down at the desk. There it was, the envelope, flattened now. Its contents spread carefully across the polished mahogany surface. The transcript pages numbered in black ink, each one lined with quiet devastation. She picked up the first again. Her eyes scanned the words she already knew by heart. "If you phrase it like that, the court won't flag it. Say in good faith." That tends to disarm them. The judge's voice was unmistakable, calm, casual, like a man giving instructions on how to fold a napkin, not manipulate a federal settlement. The timestamp, the initials, the tone, all of it authentic, and worse, familiar. Kagan's fingers tensed at the edge of the paper. The tremor had returned, a subtle shake, barely perceptible. But to her, it felt like thunder. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't an overstatement. This was a rot, and it was in her house. A knock at the door broke the silence. "Madam Justice," a voice said softly through the crack. "Press is asking for a statement." She didn't look up, didn't turn. Her gaze remained fixed on the page in her hand. "No comment," she replied, her voice dry, barely audible. There was a pause, then retreating footsteps. The door remained closed. She exhaled, sat down slowly at the edge of the desk, not in her chair, but just on the ledge. The weight of her robe hung heavy on her shoulders. She slid another page forward. This one included a footnote, casually added, almost flippant, a joke between attorneys about how easy it was to pregame the ruling. Her throat tightened. She thought of the courtroom, of Jasmine Crockett standing alone. No legal counsel, no defense team, just truth and paper. The young congresswoman hadn't come with accusations. She had come with evidence, receipts, and worse, discipline. The very thing this court had once taught was sacred. Kagan leaned back, her mind flickering to an old memory, one she hadn't allowed herself to revisit in years, a debate stage in law school. She had been 23, armed with nothing but case law and fury. She'd stared down a male professor who tried to interrupt her mid-sentence and said, "I didn't ask for permission. I came here to argue." The crowd had laughed, applauded, not because it was a good line, but because she had meant it. What happened to her? When had she gone from the challenger to the shield? She rubbed her temples and closed her eyes. She had spent the better part of 2 decades choosing her words carefully, protecting the image of the institution, protecting the machine, even when the gears ground down the people underneath it. But now, here it was, laid bare, and she couldn't unsee it. A quote came back to her, from somewhere. She didn't remember where. "Truth isn't a blade, it's a mirror. What cuts you is your reflection in it." The transcript sat there, open, clear, undeniable. For the first time in years, Justice Elena Kagan didn't feel like the arbiter of finality. She felt like someone who had spent too long explaining silence as strategy. And now she wasn't sure if she could justify a single word of it anymore. For a long time, Justice Kagan said nothing. The courtroom was a vacuum, pressurized by restraint, heavy with unsaid things. Jasmine stood motionless, her folder open but untouched. She hadn't moved in minutes. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and it wasn't in the transcripts. It was in the reflection sitting on the bench. Finally, Kagan spoke, but her voice didn't carry the weight of a ruling. It sounded like a confession pulled from the wreckage of something once held sacred. "You remind me of me," she said softly, "before I stopped believing things could change." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't remorse. It was something older, more tired. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't soften. There was no pride on her face, no flicker of vindication. Just silence. A silence that allowed the words to fall into the room without padding, without spin. Kagan leaned back slightly in her chair, as if trying to breathe through a robe that had become a burden. "I used to think the system was a tool," she continued, "that if I just rose high enough, stayed rational enough, I could fix it from within. That's what they tell you when you're young, when you're loud, when you're full of all that belief." She looked down at her hands, pale, still. One thumb ran absent-mindedly over the edge of her gavel. "But somewhere along the way," she said, "you start compromising. One ruling here, one quiet dismissal there, and before you realize it, you're not fixing the system. You're protecting it." The gallery didn't move, not a shift, not a scribble. Even the bailiff looked frozen. Kagan glanced up again, not at Jasmine, but toward the ceiling, as if searching for some answer written in plaster. She didn't find one. "I used to burn," she whispered. "Now I balance." And then, as if pulled back into her role, she cleared her throat and tried to straighten her shoulders. But it didn't take. The weight was still there, and now the whole room could see it. Jasmine finally spoke. Quiet, controlled. "Maybe it's not too late to burn again." Kagan's eyes locked with hers. No sparks, no triumph. Just 2 women staring at the place where the law and reality had finally collided, where truth had cracked the stone floor of ritual. And for the first time since the hearing began, Kagan looked uncertain. Not because she doubted the facts, but because she could no longer pretend they weren't real. This was never supposed to happen, she said almost to herself. It always was, Jasmine replied. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to, because the echo wasn't in the courtroom. It was inside Elena Kagan, inside the years she'd spent rising, calculating, silencing herself in the name of structure, in the name of legacy, in the name of maintaining something that, on this day, had been proven more fragile than anyone dared admit. No gavel dropped, no ruling came, but everyone knew something irreversible had just shifted, and it hadn't happened in the public eye. It happened in the quiet between two women, both forged by law, both fractured by silence. And for the first time, only one of them still believed the truth had power. The other had just remembered what that belief used to feel like. Justice Kagan didn't speak. She didn't lift the gavel. She didn't offer a prompt, and she didn't need to. The silence in the courtroom had become permission. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, not toward the bench but toward the center of the room, the place where witnesses usually stand. She didn't ask to speak. She didn't need a ruling. Her presence now was the permission. "I want this on the record," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried, through walls, through robes, through the weight of every eye watching. "I want it known that I did not come here to defend myself. I came here to reveal what we've all been told to look away from." She glanced toward the gallery, not for effect, but for truth. People were still frozen, but their eyes tracked her like searchlights, not waiting for a speech, but a signal that they weren't alone. "I've been told I'm dangerous, that my words could shake the foundation of the courts, that if someone acts out, it might be my fault." Her jaw clenched for a split second, then she let it go. "Do you know how many people walk into courtrooms every day already broken, already judged, before the charges are read, before a word is spoken? And still, we tell them justice is blind. But I've seen the tilt. I've felt the weight of that silence, that look, that ruling that says, 'Not today, not for you.'" She walked slowly back toward her table, her fingers brushing against the documents she'd laid out. Pages that felt less like evidence and more like ghosts. "I love this country," she said, and this time her voice cracked, not with fear, but something far more dangerous. Resolve. "And that's why I can't stay silent." That crack was raw, not rehearsed, not crafted, just true. It silenced even the breath in the room. Because silence is what let this happen. Silence is what let judges retire with clean records while families sat empty-handed. Silence is what allowed transcripts to be sealed and reporters pushed off, and rulings to be written in language so dense that no one outside the chamber could understand they were being robbed. She looked up, straight at the bench. "I didn't bring this evidence because I'm angry. I brought it because I'm done waiting, done asking nicely, done hoping that someone else would say what needed to be said first." Her chest rose and fell once, then again, but her voice didn't falter. "I brought it because truth should not be a gamble." She turned slightly, just enough to face the gallery again. "I've walked into too many rooms knowing my presence alone was a problem. I've been interrupted, ignored, laughed off, called emotional, radical, impossible. And every time I was told to pick my battles." She stopped, then finished the thought. "I picked this one." A woman in the third row had tears brimming, but refused to let them fall. A young man near the aisle gripped his pen so tightly it snapped, but he didn't notice. Jasmine looked down at the papers one last time. Then gently she closed the folder, not to hide it, but to end it. "I know what this hearing was supposed to be," she said. "A warning, a consequence, a quiet removal of noise." She looked back at Kagan. "But I'm not noise." And she sat down. Not in defeat, but in full, unshakable defiance. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't applaud. It didn't breathe. Because everyone in that room had just heard something that would not leave them. Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. Justice Elena Kagan sat motionless. The gavel rested beside her hand, cool and untouched. Her fingers hovered near it, not gripping, not lifting, just there, as if even the weight of wood now demanded second thoughts. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett had already returned to her seat. She wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't waiting for mercy. Her eyes weren't even fixed on the bench. They were locked on the floor, steady, focused, as if bracing for the final hit, one that had already been telegraphed for weeks. The gallery held its breath. The courtroom expected it. The punishment. Because that's how these stories usually end. The system protects itself. The speaker is made small. The truth is filed under inappropriate conduct and buried with procedural language. Kagan knew it. She could feel it. She could feel the pressure coiling beneath her robe like a second spine, unseen but constant. The calls she'd already heard in her head, the headlines she could already predict. Justice wavers as Congresswoman defies judicial decorum. Breakdown in bench authority. She could feel the institution leaning on her from the shadows. She reached toward the gavel, slow, deliberate, but stopped just short of it. And then she spoke. "The court has reviewed the submitted materials," she said, voice carefully measured, though thinner than before. "It has heard the respondent's full statement." She glanced up, not at Jasmine, but beyond her, toward the faceless gallery of silence and expectation. There is no doubt that the tone of the respondent's commentary was direct, even forceful. It challenged norms. It pierced institutional quiet. Pause, her fingers curled inward, just slightly. But this court is also bound by precedent, by law, another pause. Representative Jasmine Crockett's statements, however uncomfortable, were made in her official capacity as a public servant. They addressed matters of public concern. They were backed by documentation, expressed without incitement, and grounded in verifiable content. The tension fractured, but didn't release. Her voice dropped lower. Therefore, this court finds that her speech is protected under constitutional provisions afforded to members of Congress in matters of governmental oversight. There it was. A pause so total it felt like the room had stopped breathing altogether. A single intake of air could be heard near the back, followed by nothing. No applause, no gasp. Just silence. Stunned, wide-eyed silence. Jasmine didn't move. Not even her eyebrows lifted. She had prepared for the worst. She had expected the cost. But even she hadn't expected acknowledgement. Justice Kagan was still speaking, but softer now, as if the decision itself had taken something from her. This court, accordingly, does not find sufficient grounds to pursue contempt proceedings. Her hand hovered near the gavel again, but she didn't bring it down. Instead, she let it rest on the bench, unmoved, a symbolic object left untouched, as if to say, this time, the system doesn't get to make it official. This time, it ends without punishment, without ceremony. From the gallery, someone shifted in their chair. A woman near the front swallowed hard and folded her hands in her lap. A student pressed their lips together, as if trying to remember every syllable that had just changed the air in the room. Jasmine exhaled, but not from relief. It was something colder, something quieter, like a soldier who made it through the battle. Not unscarred, just standing. Justice Kagan looked at her again. Really looked. No judgment, no distance, just a brief, haunted recognition of what had just happened, of what it had cost, of how much easier it would have been to let the gavel fall, but it hadn't, because some truths don't get silence. They just get heard, even when it's far too late. Justice Kagan didn't stand immediately. Her hand hovered just above the gavel, but once again, she didn't bring it down. Instead, she reached for a separate folder that had sat quietly by her side throughout the hearing. It was black, unmarked, institutional. Jasmine hadn't noticed it before. Kagan opened it slowly and pulled out a single sheet of thick, official-grade paper. Pre-formatted, predated. A memorandum. Already drafted. Already waiting. She read it once, then again. And as the silence in the courtroom stretched, every eye locked onto that one thin page. The paper that might do what no verdict had ever dared. Turn a courtroom moment into systemic consequence. Kagan reached for her pen and signed her name. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was barely audible, but in that room it was thunder. No declaration, no flourish, just ink and decision. Then she looked up, directly at Jasmine Crockett. "This court," she said, her voice cool but no longer distant, "will be issuing a formal memorandum to the Office of Judicial Oversight, recommending a full federal-level ethics review of judicial conduct. Murmurs rippled across the room like aftershocks. Not loud, not chaotic, just the sound of disbelief folding into understanding. The documents submitted by Representative Crockett, Kagan continued, her voice tightening with control, will be entered into federal record, unredacted, unsealed, and submitted as a case study for internal reform protocols. She paused. The folder you brought in, she said, eyes narrowing slightly, will not disappear into archives. It will become part of the teaching file for every ethics clerk, every judicial nominee, every law school that asks what happens when silence becomes law. That line stopped even the scribes. Jasmine didn't move. Her body was still, but her eyes held fire. Justice Kagan finally touched the gavel, but this time she didn't raise it to strike. She simply placed it gently on the block. No slam, no judgment. A gesture that said, "This is not closure, it's ignition." "This hearing," she said softly, "is concluded." She stood. So did the clerk. So did the bailiff. But the gallery didn't rise. They remained seated, not out of disrespect, but because something in them had been anchored to the floor. A shift had occurred, not loud, not celebrated, but permanent. A crack in the edifice. Jasmine rose slowly, her folder now light in her hands, not because the burden was gone, but because the weight had been shared. She turned toward the door, walking through the same narrow aisle she had entered hours ago. Except this time, the silence she passed through wasn't one of skepticism. It was reverence, not for her title, but for what she had dared to do without one word of permission. Behind her, Justice Kagan returned to her chair, not to rest, but to face the aftermath. The transcript, the whistleblower letter, the sealed rulings, spread out before her like a crime scene that could no longer be dismissed. She didn't call for her aides. She didn't request water. She simply sat, staring at her own signature. It had been a long time since that signature meant anything more than protocol. But today it had started something irreversible. And for the first time in years, the court wasn't echoing with finality. It was holding its breath for what would come next. The courthouse doors swung open like a curtain torn back from a brutal act. And the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into the daylight, the chaos began. Microphones lunged forward like drawn weapons. Reporters spilled down the stone steps, cameras shoved into position, voices overlapping in a frenzy that blurred into static. The sky had cleared, but the pressure hadn't lifted. If anything, it had thickened. The building behind her, quiet, massive, and heavy with centuries of tradition, felt colder now. Like it had just released something it wasn't ready to admit it had been hiding. "Congresswoman, did you expect the ruling? Do you consider this a victory? Will you press for judicial resignations?" She didn't flinch. She didn't stop. But she did turn. One step from the final stair, she paused. Not to grandstand, just to say something real. "This wasn't vindication," she said, her voice low but clear enough to cut through the clamor. "It was accountability." The flashbulbs lit up like silent lightning. She didn't elaborate. She didn't raise a fist. She didn't smile. Her face was still, the lines under her eyes deeper now. Not from makeup or fatigue, but from the kind of pressure that doesn't lift when the cameras stop rolling. There was no soundtrack, no victory montage, just the sound of her heels hitting pavement and her breath pushing past adrenaline. Because this wasn't a win. It was a line drawn in concrete, one that said, "I came, I saw, I exposed it, and now it's your move." A young reporter stepped in close, too close, shoving a mic at her chin. "Congresswoman Crockett, what will you do if nothing changes?" She stopped just long enough to meet his eyes. "Then I'll speak again," she said, "and again, until someone finally does more than listen." There was no applause, no chance, just the shifting of people making room for her to pass. Behind her, the courthouse still stood tall, stoic, and expressionless, like it always had. But the people who watched her walk down those steps, they weren't the same. Some wore confusion, some wore respect, and a few, just a few, wore the haunted look of people who had just seen the system crack from the inside. As Jasmine made her way toward the waiting black car, One staffer tried to hand her a phone. "Leadership's calling," he whispered. She shook her head. "Not yet." She slid into the back seat, pulled the door closed, and let the silence wrap around her like armor. No music, no ringing, no voice but her own. Her fingers curled around the edge of the folder in her lap. Lighter now, but only by grams. The real weight wasn't paper. It was the knowledge that what she did today might trigger change, or might simply echo into more silence. But she had spoken. Loud enough, clear enough, measured enough. She leaned her head against the window. Outside, the courthouse steps were already being scrubbed from the news cycle. Analysts would spin it, commentators would frame it, but none of them had sat in that room when the gavel didn't fall. None of them had watched Justice Kagan hesitate. Jasmine closed her eyes. Not in peace, but in clarity, because this wasn't justice. It was just the first crack in the wall. And cracks never look like triumphs when they first appear. They look like fatigue. The envelope was plain. No seal, no crest, no return address. Just her name, typed, not handwritten, on a single line. Representative Jasmine E. Crockett. It arrived 3 days after the hearing, delivered not by courier, not by staff, but by hand. Her legislative aide had found it on the corner of her desk that morning, as if someone had slipped it in when no one was looking. Jasmine didn't touch it for the first 10 minutes. She simply stared at it from across the room, as if expecting it to vanish before she could open it. Part of her didn't want to. When she finally broke the flap and slid the paper free, she felt the tension tighten rather than release. It wasn't long, just one page, typed on judicial letterhead, but it was enough. "I've read the transcript 4 times. That was the opening line. No pleasantries, no title, no dear Congresswoman. Just the beginning. Abrupt, brutal, honest. I may not agree with your method, but I cannot deny your message." Jasmine's eyes stopped there for a moment. Her breath caught, not out of surprise, but something closer to recognition. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't praise. It was something far more difficult to put into words. Surrender. You spoke in a room that has long trained itself not to listen, and somehow you were heard. Her fingers gripped the edge of the letter tighter. You forced a conversation many of us have avoided for far too long. For that, I owe you more than a ruling. That was it. No signature, no flourish. Just a name at the bottom, typed, Elna Kagan. No justice, no honorable, just the name. Jasmine read it twice more, then folded it gently along the crease and set it beside her laptop. Not hidden, not framed, just visible, just there. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of it all pressing against her shoulders again, but differently now, not heavier, just real. Outside her office window, the Capitol dome sat unmoved, stubborn and silent as ever. The news cycle had moved on. Congressional chatter had quieted. No press vans lined up. No protesters chanted her name. To the world, it was over. But Jasmine knew better. Moments like that don't end. They ripple. And letters like this don't just appear. They mark a fracture, not wide, not loud, but deep. She thought back to the courtroom, to the way Kagan's hand had trembled on the transcript, to the gavel she never dropped, to the silence that followed Jasmine's final words. Not because they landed like a punch, but because they'd exposed the bruise. Now this letter, delivered in quiet, written in restraint, signed in absence. It said more than any ruling ever could. Not a thank you, not an alliance, but a confession. That silence had a cost, and someone had finally stopped paying it. Jasmine picked up the letter again and ran her thumb slowly across the edge. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded once, barely. Not because she'd won, but because the wall finally made a sound, and she heard it crack. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, but Jasmine Crockett's office still burned with fluorescent light. The city outside had slowed, but not here. Not behind this glass. The blinds were half closed. A single lamp glowed behind her desk, and she was still at it. Shoulders stiff, jaw tight, fingers tracing through notes as if the pages might rewrite themselves if she blinked. 3 coffee mugs sat stacked on the edge of the table like tired sentries. Her inbox was still overflowing. Her staff had gone home. She hadn't told them to leave. They just knew when silence meant space. The letter from Justice Kagan sat quietly at the edge of her desk, folded, unframed, unmoved. It hadn't changed the world, but it had changed the silence. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, the weight of her blazer pressing against the worn leather like armor not yet removed. She looked around the room, not at the clutter, not at the late-night reminders of unfinished policy fights, but at the whiteboard mounted near the window. For months, it had been blank except for one question, written in bold black marker. What are we doing that actually matters? Every morning she saw it. Every night she ignored it. Until tonight. She stood slowly, her back stiff from hours of sitting, walked over to the board, picked up the marker, paused, and then wrote under that question. Not in cursive, not in shorthand. Each letter clear, controlled, final. Pushing even when it gets you punished. She capped the pen and stepped back. No smile, no dramatic music, just the hiss of the office heat and the distant hum of a vacuum in another hallway. Because this wasn't a conclusion. This was a scar. And scars don't sing. They whisper, they warn. She turned back toward her desk. Her phone buzzed. Another interview request. She let it ring. She wasn't ready to talk about what happened. Not yet. People wanted a soundbite, a headline, something neat, something brave. But what she had done wasn't neat, and it wasn't brave. It was necessary. The folder she'd carried into that courtroom had become something else now. Not just documentation, not just evidence. It was a mirror, one that couldn't be unbroken, and she knew what came next. Retaliation, dismissal, isolation, maybe worse. But she didn't come here to be liked. She didn't come to be safe. She came to name the thing no one else would, and that meant she was only at the beginning. Jasmine walked to the window, pulled the blinds all the way open, and looked out at the Capitol dome. Still lit, still still. A monument to permanence. But even stone cracks under pressure. She pressed her fingertips to the glass. A crack had started. It wasn't wide. It wasn't loud. But it was real, and she would follow it until it split the whole wall. The office was nearly dark now. Only the soft glow from Jasmine's desk lamp lit the room, casting long shadows across the floor. The city beyond the window buzzed on without her, its lights indifferent to what had unfolded just days ago. But here, the silence wasn't emptiness. It was reflection. And in that silence, her phone buzzed once, then stopped. Voicemail. She reached for it absently, not expecting anything. The screen displayed an unknown number from Arizona. Probably spam, probably noise. But something, instinct maybe, told her to press play. A young woman's voice crackled through the speaker, shaky at first, then steady. Hi, sorry to be weird, but I'm a first-year law student, and I watched your hearing, all of it, every minute. A pause. Jasmine leaned forward, her thumb hovering near the stop button, but she didn't press it. I guess I just wanted to say, you made me believe again. Another pause, breath caught, then a whisper barely audible, that someone could walk in alone and still be heard. Click. End of message. Jasmine set the phone down slowly, screen dimming in her palm. Her fingers curled around the edge of her desk as she closed her eyes. One deep exhale escaped her chest. Not relief, not release. Something deeper, something earned. She sat in that stillness, alone again, but not hollow, not this time, because someone had been watching. Someone had heard her, and somewhere one future voice had decided not to stay silent. Not anymore. Jasmine opened her eyes. No applause, no parade, just a flicker of clarity that said, the fight doesn't end when the court adjourns. It ends when the next one picks up where you left off. It was well past midnight. The Capitol lights were still glowing, but they felt miles away, unreachable, like stars you could see but never touch. Jasmine Crockett sat alone at her desk, one hand resting on a closed legal pad, the other on the phone she hadn't put down all evening. The message from the law student still echoed in her mind. Not the words, but the pause before them. The hesitation. The disbelief that anyone had heard her at all. She glanced toward the whiteboard. Pushing even when it gets you punished. The ink had dried, but the moment hadn't. Without thinking, Jasmine reached for her phone and opened the voice memos app. She'd done this before. Late-night thoughts she didn't share. She didn't write speeches in those moments. She didn't rehearse. She recorded because sometimes the only person who could hold the weight was her future self. She hit record. For a second, nothing. Then her voice. Low, quiet, but unmistakably certain. If you're listening to this, it means you need to remember why we don't stop. A pause. Breath caught. Not because it's easy, or because it gets us anything but trouble, but because if we let fear of consequence stop us, we've already lost. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as her words floated in the dark. I didn't go into that courtroom to be brave. I went in because someone had to. Because silence doesn't protect the innocent. It protects the powerful. Another pause. You'll be told to wait, to trust the process, to be strategic. But what no one tells you is how long those delays cost the people who don't have the privilege to wait. Her hand moved to her collarbone, fingers pressing lightly, almost grounding herself. I've spent too much of my life choosing the right moment, and I'm tired of waiting for permission. Her voice faltered for half a breath. Truth doesn't need permission. The room was still. Outside, the streets were empty. Inside, every word hit like a match struck in the dark. I don't know if what I did made anything better. I don't know if the system will shift. But I know what happens when we stop trying. She closed her eyes. The world gets quieter. Not safer, just quieter. And sometimes that silence is the most dangerous thing of all. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. But something in her chest cracked open a little, just wide enough to breathe through. I'm recording this for the day when I start questioning again. When I start asking whether it's worth it, whether speaking out was a mistake, a breath. And when that day comes, I want to remind myself of something. She opened her eyes, leaned forward, voice narrowing to a whisper. You said what needed to be said, even when it cost you something, and that matters. She stared at the glowing red dot on the screen, still recording, still listening. She didn't stop it right away. She let the silence speak first. Then she reached down, tapped the button, and saved the file. No title, no date, just one word. Still. She didn't release it, didn't share it, didn't post it, but she saved it. Because some truths aren't meant for the world. They're meant for the moments we almost forget why we started. If you ever find yourself at a table where no one will name the lie in the room, name it anyway. If the silence feels rehearsed, if the rules feel designed to keep your hands folded and your head down, lift your voice anyway. If the consequence is isolation, if the reward is nothing but another closed door, speak anyway, not for applause, not for recognition, but because truth doesn't echo in rooms where no one dares to say it out loud. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courthouse to win. She walked in knowing she'd be outnumbered, knowing she'd be labeled angry, disruptive, ungrateful, but she also knew what was waiting if she stayed quiet. More names buried, more rulings sealed, more systems untouched because no one had the stomach to challenge what had always been. She didn't bring fire to burn things down. She brought paper, evidence, receipts, and she brought a voice steady enough to cut through centuries of deference. What happened that day wasn't a performance. It was a rupture, quiet, precise, permanent. The kind of rupture that doesn't shatter buildings, it shifts foundations. And maybe that's the lesson we forget. That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in alone, unfolds a folder, and tells the truth, knowing full well it might cost everything. Because if we only speak when it's safe, if we only tell the truth when the room is ready to hear it, then we aren't really speaking, we're negotiating. And justice has never been built by negotiation. It's been carved out of refusal. So here it is, the final lesson. Say it anyway. Even when your voice shakes, even when the rules are weaponized against you, even when you are told to wait to smile, to be softer. Say it anyway, because silence doesn't protect you. It only delays the fallout. And if you're going to stand in the fire, better to be the match than the ash. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk away a hero. She walked away heard. And sometimes that's enough to break the pattern. Sometimes one voice is the start of a reckoning. So ask yourself, what lie are you sitting next to in silence? And when will you decide to name it? And maybe that's the quiet truth we forget in a world that rewards performance over principle. Sometimes justice doesn't look like a victory. Sometimes it looks like one person standing in a room designed to break them and refusing to disappear. Jasmine didn't dismantle the system in a day, but she made it look at itself. She forced the robe to remember the face beneath it. She reminded power that its silence is not sacred and that tradition is not immunity. What she carried into that courtroom wasn't just evidence. It was every unheard story, every buried truth, every young voice waiting to see if speaking up was still worth it. And what she left behind wasn't noise. It was proof that even the most fortified walls crack when someone dares to speak without flinching. In the end, the lesson isn't about being right. It's about being unwilling to let what's wrong pass as normal. It's about understanding that silence is never neutral, that fear is never the final word, and that sometimes the boldest act of love for your country, your people, and yourself is to confront what others have learned to tolerate. Because if truth makes you a target, then truth must still matter. And the most radical thing you can do in a world built on silence is say it anyway. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.